Brexit, the issue certainly of my time and many others. As a British citizen, this decision has certainly impacted my life, politics, and maybe even my outlook on the future. So I've decided to do this episode not as an opinion piece, but as a historical narrative, an incredibly divisive topic even today. I've tried to keep this as non political as possible. We hope you enjoy the episode, and of course, any comments are welcome below. In June of 2016, the United Kingdom voted to leave the European Union. The result shocked financial markets, divided political parties, and triggered one of the most turbulent periods in modern British political history. But Brexit did not appear suddenly. Its origins stretch back decades, long before the referendum campaign, before Nigel Farage, before all the slogans on buses and arguments about immigration. There had already been a deep and persistent British unease about Europe. In many ways, Brexit began almost as soon as Britain entered the European project itself. To understand why Britain eventually voted to leave, it is necessary to go back to the 1970s, back to a country facing economic decline, political uncertainty, and an identity crisis about its place in the world. Following the devastation of the Second World War, many European nations began pursuing closer cooperation in the hope of preventing another catastrophic conflict. This gradual process eventually produced the European Economic Community, commonly known as the EEC. Britain initially remained outside of it. Many British politicians still believed the United Kingdom was fundamentally different from continental Europe. Britain possessed global trade links, strong ties to the Commonwealth, and what remained of a fading imperial identity. London often viewed European integration with caution, but in the 1960s, Britain's economic position had weakened significantly. France and West Germany were experiencing rapid economic growth, while Britain struggled with industrial decline, inflation, and repeated financial crisis. Increasingly, membership of the EEC appeared economically necessary. There was, however, a major obstacle. French President Charles de Gaulle deeply distrusted Britain. He believed the British were too closely tied to the United States and insufficiently committed to the European project. Twice in 1963 and 1967, he vetoed British attempts to join. Only after de Gaulle left office did Britain finally succeed. In 1973, under Conservative Prime Minister Edward Heath, Britain officially entered the EEC. For Heath, joining Europe represented economic pragmatism and geopolitical reality. Britain could no longer act as an isolated global power. Membership offered access to trade, investment, and influence. But from the very beginning, the decision proved controversial. Many Britons had never been fully consulted about joining. Others feared that parliamentary sovereignty was being surrendered to European institutions overseas. This issue quickly became politically explosive. In 1975, only 2 years after entry, the British government held a national referendum on continued membership in the EEC. It will be the first nationwide referendum in British history. The Labour Party itself had become deeply divided over Europe. Prime Minister Harold Wilson attempted to contain these divisions by renegotiating Britain's terms and then allowing the public to decide. The result appeared decisive. Roughly 67% voted to remain in the EEC. Most major newspapers, business leaders, and political figures supported continued membership. Even many who disliked aspects of European integration still believed leaving would damage the economy. For a time, the European question seemed settled, but beneath the surface, doubts remained. Some critics believed Britain was slowly surrendering democratic control to unelected European institutions. Others feared European integration would continue expanding far beyond economics. Over the following decades, these concerns steadily grew. The 1980s marked a major turning point in Britain's relationship with Europe. Prime Minister Margaret Thatcher initially supported aspects of European cooperation, particularly free trade and economic liberalisation. However, she became increasingly hostile towards what she viewed as growing European centralisation. One issue caused particular anger: Britain was contributing large sums to the European budget while receiving comparatively little back through agricultural subsidiaries. Thatcher aggressively demanded reform, famously declaring, "I want my money back." Eventually, Britain secured a rebate on its contributions. Yet Thatcher's broader suspicion of Europe integration only intensified. In 1988, she delivered the famous Bruges speech warning against the creation of a European superstate, exercising authority from Brussels. The speech became enormously influential among British Eurosceptics. For many conservatives, Europe was no longer an economic arrangement. It had become a constitutional and cultural threat to British sovereignty. This growing Euroscepticism increasingly divided the Conservative Party itself. That internal division would shape British politics for decades. The collapse of the Soviet Union and the end of the Cold War accelerated European integration even further. In 1992, European leaders signed the Maastricht Treaty, formally creating the EU. This treaty expanded political cooperation, introduced the concept of European citizenship, and laid the foundations for the euro currency. To supporters, Maastricht represented progress towards greater European unity. To critics in Britain, it confirmed their fears. Many conservatives viewed the treaty as a massive transfer of power away from Westminster. Prime Minister John Major struggled desperately to keep his party united while ratifying the treaty through Parliament. The rebellion inside his own government became fierce. A group of strongly anti-European conservative MPs, later known as Eurosceptics, repeatedly challenged Major's authority. Europe had now become one of the most destructive internal conflicts in modern conservative history. At the same time, a new political movement slowly began emerging outside of the political mainstream. In 1993, the United Kingdom Independence Party, UKIP, was founded. At first, it remained small and largely ignored, but over time, UKIP would fundamentally reshape British politics. Throughout the late 1990s and early 2000s, Britain's relationship with Europe remained uneasy. Labour Prime Minister Tony Blair generally supported closer European cooperation, although Britain remained outside of the EU and the euro currency system. Yet several developments gradually strengthened Eurosceptic feeling among sectors of the British public. One major factor was immigration. In 2004, the EU expanded eastward, admitting several former Eastern Bloc nations, including Poland. Under EU freedom of movement rules, citizens from these countries could legally work in Britain. The British government expected relatively low migration numbers. Instead, hundreds of thousands arrived over the following years. Many businesses welcomed the workers, particularly in construction, agriculture, and service industries. Britain's economy was growing, and labour shortages existed in many sectors. But politically, the issue became explosive. Some communities experienced rapid demographic changes. Pressure on housing, pressure on schools, pressure on public services became frequent political concerns. Others feared downward pressure on wages, although economists often disputed the scale of that effect. Immigration increasingly merged with wider anxieties about national identity, sovereignty, and ultimately social change. UKIP recognized the political opportunity immediately. The rise of Nigel Farage transformed UKIP from a fringe party into a major political force. Farage possessed a very different political style from traditional British politicians. He spoke in plain, confrontational language and presented himself as an outsider challenging a detached political elite. His central argument was simple: Britain had lost control. According to Farage and other Eurosceptics, the European Union membership prevented Britain from controlling immigration, its laws, borders, and trade policies. Brussels became portrayed not merely as bureaucratic, but as fundamentally undemocratic. This message resonated strongly with some voters, particularly in areas experiencing economic decline or political alienation. In 2008, global financial crisis intensified these feelings even further. Trust in political institutions collapsed across much of the Western world. Anger towards elites, experts, and established political parties grew significantly. Austerity policies introduced after the crisis also contributed to widespread frustration. By the early 2010s, pressure for a referendum was becoming difficult to ignore, especially inside the Conservative Party. Prime Minister David Cameron faced mounting rebellion from Eurosceptic Conservative MPs as well as growing electoral pressure from UKIP. Many Conservative voters were drifting towards Farage's party. Cameron personally supported remaining within the European Union. However, he believed the issue needed to be politically neutralised. In 2013, he made a dramatic promise. If the Conservatives won the next general election, they would hold an in-out referendum on EU membership. At the time, many assumed the pledge was mainly tactical. Some expected the Conservatives would fail to win a parliamentary majority and therefore would never actually hold the referendum. Others assumed the British public would ultimately vote to remain just as they had in 1975. But the political gamble quickly spiraled beyond anyone's control. In the 2015 general election, the Conservatives unexpectedly won a majority government. Cameron was now committed to delivering the referendum. Before the vote, Cameron attempted to renegotiate Britain's membership terms with European leaders. He hoped modest reforms would persuade voters that Britain could remain inside a reformed EU. The negotiations produced limited concessions, but they failed to fundamentally reshape the debate. The referendum campaign rapidly became emotional, polarized, and deeply divisive. Two rival campaigns emerged. Remain argued that leaving the European Union would create economic chaos, damage trade, reduce investment, and weaken Britain internationally. Major business organizations, financial institutions, and many economists supported this position. Meanwhile, the Leave campaign focused heavily on sovereignty, immigration, and national control. One of the most famous slogans became "Take Back Control." It proved enormously effective. The Leave campaign argued Britain should govern itself independently, make its own laws, control immigration policy, and negotiate its own trade agreements. Immigration became perhaps the single most powerful issue during the campaign. The European migrant crisis of 2015 had intensified fears about borders and migration across Europe. Images of large migrant flows dominated the news coverage. Although Britain was not part of the Schengen open border zone, many voters nevertheless associated EU membership with a broader loss of border control. Social media also played a major role. The referendum campaign unfolded during an era of rising online political warfare, targeted advertising, misinformation, and increasingly hostile political discourse. Claims and counterclaims were spread constantly. Experts warned of severe economic consequences if Britain voted to leave, but many Leave supporters had grown deeply distrustful of the experts themselves. At one point, leading conservative Eurosceptic Michael Gove famously declared, "People in the country have had enough of experts." This statement became symbolic of the wider political atmosphere surrounding Brexit. As voting day approached, the country appeared deeply divided. Age, geography, education, and class increasingly influenced voting intentions. London, Scotland, and many university cities leaned strongly towards remaining. Meanwhile, many smaller towns, post-industrial areas, and rural communities leaned towards leaving. For some voters, Brexit became an expression of national sovereignty. For others, it became a protest against political elites, economic inequality, immigration, or even a broader cultural change. And for many younger voters especially, it represented a struggle over Britain's future identity. Was Britain fundamentally European or fundamentally separate from Europe? On June the 23rd, 2016, the British public cast their votes. Throughout the evening, many commentators still expected a narrow victory for Remain. Instead, the results gradually revealed something very different. Leave had won. 51.9% voted to leave the European Union. 48.1% voted to remain. The political shock was immediate. Financial markets reacted violently. The pound collapsed in value. Prime Minister David Cameron announced his resignation within hours. Britain had voted for the largest constitutional change in modern history. Yet remarkably, no detailed plan for leaving actually existed. The referendum answered one question, but it unleashed countless others, and the turmoil that followed would dominate British politics for years.